What I wanted to also show you is a little bit of a kind of history of what's going on with the U.S. economy over the last 40 and 50 years, because I know a lot of you are in business or on the investment business, and Kelly asked me to just chat a little bit about what are some of the kind of fundamental trends in the U.S. economy, what's going right and what's going wrong. And I like to first show you, what I call America's boom and bust cycle. And I should call it America's bust, boom, and bust cycle, because if you look at this chart, this is the blue line you're looking at is the stock market, the S&P 500 over the last 50 years. The red line is a little bit, maybe you're not quite as familiar with. The red line is the S&P 500, but what I've done is inflation adjusted the returns, because all of you know that when you make an investment, you're interested in your after inflation, not your before inflation rate of return. And what's interesting about this chart is these kind of diagonal lines you can see. You can see what happened in the 1970s, which actually was the worst decade for the U.S. economy since the Great Depression. I always get annoyed when people say, when Barack Obama says, I inherited the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. That actually isn't true. He did inherit a great economic crisis, but not nearly as steep an economic crisis as President Reagan did in 1981. But you can see what happened over this period from the early 1970s through the early 1980s. U.S. stocks and actually all financial assets adjusted for inflation lost about 60% of their value. And I think we can all agree that's a pretty ferocious bear market and evaporation of wealth when you see that kind of long-term decline in asset values. And then you can see what happens starting in the early 1980s. You see the biggest bull market expansion in the U.S. economy in the history of the country. In fact, I'd make the case what you're looking at there in the 1980s and 1990s is the greatest economic boom in the history of civilization. No country has experienced anything like this massive wealth creation, prosperity that happened in the 80s and 90s. And just to give a sense of how awesome that was, if you invested $1 in the market in 1982, that dollar by the year 2000 was worth about $22. So and a massive expansion in the wealth of the American economy and American households. And then you can see over the last decade, you can see those two, isn't it interesting? It looks almost like a double-humped camel, that the U.S. economy went through two gut-wrenching declines, the first one being in 1999 and 2000. And I'm always surprised at how many people have forgotten about that one, but that, of course, was when you had the dot-com revolution bubble bursting, and you had the high technology stocks that cratered. And you can see that was about $8 trillion of lost wealth. And then the economy picked up steam and revived in 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then, of course, in 2008, you know the rest of the story. In 2008, we have the horrible real estate crisis, the subprime mortgages and so on, and there's another $8 trillion of wealth lost. And now this chart is a little bit out of date. We're kind of right back where we started in 2000, which is why we're calling this the lost decade. The last 10 to 12 years has been kind of a lost period for wealth creation. Now, the question we should all be asking ourselves as Americans, and every policy maker in Washington, D.C. should be asking this question, is how do we get back onto this virtuous path that we were on in the 80s and 90s? And by the way, so you don't think I'm trying to make any kind of partisan point here, the economy exploded in the 80s under Reagan, but it grew even faster in the 90s under Bill Clinton. Of course, that was also a period when Newt Gingrich became Speaker and so on, and you had a incredible growth spurt in that period. So the question is, what caused it? Now, I want to show you this chart because this is my favorite chart in this graph. And this is a chart I actually showed last week to, I gave a talk to about 25 of the Republican senators in Washington, and they were kind of blown away by this. The blue line you're looking at is the highest income tax rate in the United States. And so you can see in the 1970s, the highest rate in the United States was 70%, and then Reagan came in, and with the help of people like Jack Kemp and Arthur Laffer and the Wall Street Journal editorial page and others, the argument was made quite correctly, in my opinion, that those tax rates were so high that they were suffocating the economy, that you weren't seeing the kind of innovation and job creation and new business creation that you would normally see. And so you can see what happens. Under Reagan, the highest income tax rate went from 70% all the way down to 50%, and then a few years later, it went all the way down to 28%. Now, that is a pretty remarkable experience. It's no wonder, by the way, when the top tax rate went from 70 to 28%, that you saw this massive takeoff in the stock market in the American economy, because it meant at the beginning of the period, a 70% tax rate, you could only keep 30 cents on the dollar. At the end of the period, when Reagan left office, you were able to keep 32 cents after tax on the dollar, and that's a doubling of the return on working and investment. Now, here's the interesting thing. You can see the rates went up a little bit and down a little bit in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but over the whole period, the highest income tax rate in this country was cut in half. Now, here's the fun part about this chart and why so much, as wonderful it is to be talking to you all tonight, I cannot tell you how much I wish sitting at that table right there were Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and Joe Biden and Barack Obama, because I just think on these tax issues, they don't have their tray tables in the upright and locked position, right? They just don't understand this stuff. So you can see the red line, see that red line, what that's measuring is the share of taxes that is paid by the richest 1% in America. Now look at that, that's amazing. The share of taxes paid by the rich actually increased even as the tax rate fell. Wow, that's an amazing thing. In fact, the share of taxes paid by the richest 1% more than doubled over this period when the rates fell. Now, what do we deduce from that? Well, I would deduce from that exactly what John F. Kennedy deduced from this. 50 years ago, people forget that 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy, shortly before he was assassinated, was promoting a big supply-side income tax rate reduction. And I want to read you this quote because it's one of my favorite quotes from American history. He said, "It is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low." And this is the part I love, ladies and gentlemen. He says, "The soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now." Wow, wow. How many Democrats in Washington today believe that? Pretty close to zero. They just passed $1 trillion tax increase on Saturday morning. I don't know how many of you watched you probably didn't watch it because it went on until about 4 o'clock in the morning. They passed $1 trillion budget with a $1 trillion tax increase, and that's on top of the $600 billion tax increase that was passed in January. Remember when we had the fiscal cliff negotiations, and it was on top of the $1.1 trillion 10-year tax increase under Obamacare. So they continue to raise these rates when the lesson of history is that if you want to get more revenues, lower the rates, not raise them. And by the way, Georgia should be doing that as well. Now, people would say, well, we have to have a fair tax system, right? We have to have a system where the rich are paying their fair share. In fact, that's the whole theme of my book about who's the fairest of them all. I got into this question about who's really paying the taxes in America. And a lot of you are probably familiar with these statistics, but most Americans have no idea. So I want to just show you this. The blue line is the same one I just showed you before. That's the share of taxes paid by the richest 1%. The red line is the share of taxes paid by the bottom 95%. Now, what's interesting about this to me is look at what happened in 2007. For the first time in American history, the richest 1 out of 100 Americans, the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts and the Tiger Woods and the Lady Gagas and the evil people like that, they paid a higher share of the income tax than the bottom 95. 1 out of 100 paid more in tax than 95 out of 100. I would make the case to you that that's a pretty significantly progressive tax system. Now, if I were with Robert Reich, I debate Robert Reich all the time on CNBC and some of these other shows, and he was an economist with the Clinton administration. He doesn't get this stuff very well either. He would say, look, Steve, of course the rich pay all the taxes. They make all the money. Right? They make all the money, so they should be paying all the taxes. Well, that's not exactly true. This is the top 1%. You can see there that the top 1% in America today make about 19% of the total income in the United States. That's a lot. That's more than it's been at any time since the 1920s. By the way, one of the interesting things about, and this is one of the key features of the American economy that Sonny exemplifies so much in his own personal experience. In this great, great country, does anybody want to take a guess at what the number of years that the average person remains in that top 1% category? The number is 4 years. So in this great country of ours, it's not that hard to make it to the top of the mountain, but it sure is hard to stay there. And so what I'm saying is people are moving out of that category all the time. But more interestingly, I think, is what's happening with the income tax share. And if you look at this, the bottom 50% in America, all Americans with an income below the median in the United States today, they are paying 2% of the income tax. 2%. Now, I want to conceptualize this because I think it is such an important point to make. I'm standing right smack in the middle of this room. And let's say, for argument's sake, that all of you to the left of me in this room, let's say you're in the top 50% of income in this room, and let's say all of you to the right of me, let's say that you're in the bottom 50% of the income in this room. And let's say that we were going to pay for this wonderful dinner that we've just had the same way we pay our income taxes. The way this is going to work is that you all on this side of the table, you're going to pick up 98% of the tab, and you lucky duckies over here, you're going to pay 2%. Right? Does that sound fair to you? Yeah. And that's the way our income tax structure works. And by the way, because this gentleman right here in the front, since he's the richest person in the room, he's going to pick up 40% of the tab himself. And by the way, if Robert Reich were here, what he would say is, this doesn't work because these sons of bitches aren't paying enough, right? And that's the discussion that we're having on taxes in Washington today. And the point now let me make one other point, if I may, about this, because I feel pretty strongly about this. If you take the bottom 40%, anyone want to take a guess at what percentage of the income tax they pay? I see a lot of you going like this, 0. The bottom 40% in America today pay 0% of the income tax. Now, I wonder how many of you agree. And by the way, that's not so much because of Democratic policy, it's because of Republican policy. My hero, Ronald Reagan, we took more and more millions of Americans off the income tax rolls. George Bush took millions of Americans off the income tax rolls, and I believe that that is a mistake. And I wonder how many of you agree with me on this. I have come to the conclusion that in this great, great, great country of ours, that anyone who is a citizen, anyone who works, and anyone who is a voter, everyone should pay some income tax in this country. And I think we've made a big mistake in taking so many people. And by the way, I'm not talking about soaking the poor. I'm saying even if it's only $50 or $100 or $200, everybody should pay something. Now, let me just change directions a little bit, because some of you were asking me about this at dinner, about what's happening with our monetary policy, because if you really want to understand what's ailing our economy, you have to understand what's happening with the Fed. And by the way, I understand completely that talking about monetary policy is about the most boring subject that an economist can talk about. I mean, I travel all over this country of ours. I'm on planes all the time, and the bane of my existence is to get stuck in a middle seat on an airline. I just won't do it. I can't stand it. And so I've developed this trick that works every time, and you can try it if you ever get stuck in a middle seat on an airplane. What I do is I start talking about monetary policy, and the whole row just clears out, you know, and I get it all to myself. So anyway, but I want to make this very simple. What you're looking at here is one of the most remarkable phenomena in American history, which is the massive amount of money that the Fed has been printing with its printing presses. I don't think we've ever seen this in the history of this country. And you can see what's happening here in October of 2008 when the U.S. economy collapsed. You can see that there was the massive injection of money into the economy. This is why we call him Helicopter Ben, by the way. It's almost like what Ben Bernanke has been doing for the last 5 years is loading up a helicopter with $100 bills, flying over major cities and dropping those $100 bills out the window. And you can see we had QE1, which was the first major injection of funds. And actually, the first major injection of funds wasn't considered a quantitative easing, but it certainly was. And then in 2009, you see what happens with QE1, where the federal government bought $1 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. And then QE2 was even more interesting and maybe even more destructive. With QE2, the United States Federal Reserve Board purchased $1 trillion of 30-year Treasury bills. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Think about the implications of that. What that means is that the left hand of the government, the Treasury Department, is issuing $1 trillion worth of bonds every year because we're running up $1 trillion deficit every year. By the way, that's because of the overspending by Congress. And then the right hand of the government, the Federal Reserve Bank, is actually purchasing those debt instruments. And how does the Fed get the money to purchase those bonds? They print the money. Now, what I've just described to you, ladies and gentlemen, is what we as economists call monetizing the debt. Monetizing the debt, or let me make this even more simple. What's happening in the United States today with our monetary policy is what I call the Argentina, Bolivia, and Mexico model. Right? That's what countries do when they have a debt cycle, is they continue to have to print money to pay off their debts. Now, you can do that for a while, but the question is what happens when the music stops? I think this is a very dangerous situation. And look, a great nation, as my friend Larry Kudlow likes to say, and he's so right about this, you know, the Federal Reserve can print money, but it cannot print jobs. And there's an attitude in Washington that all we have to do is print money and we're going to get out of our economic problems, and I wish it were that easy. Now, Now, I want to show you a related point, which I think is really kind of startling. This is the interest rate picture in the U.S. economy over the last 50 years. And you can see during the great inflation and the great interest rate spikes in the 1970s. How many in this room are old enough to remember in 1980 when we had 20% mortgage interest rates? Do you remember that? And we had, anybody remember 14.5% inflation that we had in 1980? And you could see what happens. Reagan came in, and there was an almost immediate reduction in inflation and interest rates. And then if you want to see a beautiful picture, look what's happened in the U.S. economy over the last 30 years with the interest rates going down, 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 so much so that today, this is a little bit out of date, it's about a month out of date, that the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury bill today is just a little bit below 2%. Now, that is a remarkable thing and something that we as economists, certainly this economist, believe was impossible. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, is this possible, I would say no, because what I'm showing you there is a negative real interest rate. That is to say, the inflation rate in the U.S. economy today is running at somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5%, and yet Americans, we're all doing this. Everybody in this room is doing it. Everybody around the country and around the world is buying these 10-year Treasury bills at a less than 2% interest rate, even though we have 2.5% inflation. Now, that is, I would make the case to you, ladies and gentlemen, that is psychotic behavior, right? Why would people do that? Why are Americans doing that? Let me make it very simple, because sometimes these concepts get complicated. What this means, what a negative real interest rate on government bonds means, is that throughout this country, what Americans are doing is they're lending money to the United States government for 10 years, and the United States government is promising that in 10 years' time, it will pay back less than we lent to them, right? That's craziness, right? Why would people do that? Why would people engage in that kind of bizarre activity? And I would submit to you that what is going on in the American economy is look, let me put it like this. The market is driven, you know this, from your first investment course. There are two things that drive the American markets and the American economy: fear and greed, right? Fear and greed. And what's driving the American economy right now, the underlying sentiment in the American economy today is fear. The reason people are buying these 10-year Treasury bills at a negative real interest rate is American consumers, American businessmen are still afraid. They're terrified about what Washington is doing. And so what they're saying, when you buy a 10-year Treasury bill at a negative real interest rate, what you're really saying is, I don't care if I make any money on this investment, I just want the principal to be protected, right? That's why people are buying these 10-year Treasury bills. Now, what I'm saying is, look, and the economy is actually picking up a lot in the last couple of months, and I pray that that continues. As that continues, one of the problems we have as an economy right now is those interest rates start to creep up. And Kelly, if you're nice enough to have me back, let's say 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, I am willing to bet any or all comers in this room $100 that 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, take your pick, that interest rates will be higher then than they are today. Anybody want to take me up on that? It's not a very bold bet, right? Because the interest rates can hardly be any lower. And this puts us in a very dangerous position, because when those interest rates start to rise, what does that mean for the United States deficit? It goes up, right? Because who is the biggest debtor in the world today? Uncle Sam is. And this is one of the things that really frightens me, is that as those rates go up, we're going to be paying more and more and more of our taxes, not for the government services, not for Social Security, not for national defense, not for Medicare, not for the Supreme Court, not for Congress, but just simply paying the interest on the debt. By the way, in 9 years, if you want to know what a threat this is to American prosperity, in 9 years' time, the single biggest expenditure item in the United States budget will be interest payments on the debt. I find that to be highly, highly problematic. Now, let me just show you one other thing. Kelly was telling me that one of the major projects that Georgia Policy Foundation is really spending some attention on, in a big way, obviously, is education reform, and I applaud totally what you all are doing in this area. If you want to see, this is looking at price changes in the American economy over the last 10 years. And it's interesting, if you look at major consumer items, cars and trucks and clothing and textiles and computers, those are falling in price, which is a very good thing. It means that these things become more and more affordable to Americans over time. That's a wonderful thing to see. Now look, but what I want you all to concentrate on is the areas in the American economy over the last 10 years where we've seen the biggest increase in prices, the biggest increase. Now put energy aside because that's a commodity. Look at the other two industries in America where prices have been growing out of control: healthcare and education. Healthcare and education. Now, What do those two industries have in common? Well, let me put it differently. Who runs those two industries, right? The government does, right? And it's amazing to me, look at education, these massive increases in education costs. I find this to be so diabolical because actually prices in education should be falling, they shouldn't be rising. We're living in a technological age where the education system should be harnessing the power of lower costs of technology and reducing their costs. But I would make the case to you, and this is why I'm so glad that Kelly said one of the big focuses of Georgia Public Policy Foundation over the next few years is going to be looking at higher education and college tuitions, because I got to tell you, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest scam in America, the biggest crime in America is how much our universities and colleges are costing American families. It is one of the big outrages. And I got to tell you this, I have a son, you mentioned in your kind introduction, I have 3 children. I have, 2 teenagers who I don't like very much, and then I have an 11-year-old. But my two teenagers are in college. One's at Northwestern, and I hail from the state of Illinois, and so my other son is at my alma mater, University of Illinois. But my oldest son goes to Northwestern. And I wonder how many of you in this room can guess what Northwestern costs all in, room, board, and tuition today per year. Somebody said 60, you're pretty close. $62,500 a year. That is thievery. That's robbery, right? I told my son, I'm not making this up, the day he's packing his bags, ready to go off to college, sat next to him on the bed in his bedroom, and I said, Justin, look, I promised you I would pay for your tuition in college, and I'll honor that agreement, but I said, I wasn't that excited about going to Northwestern because it's one of the most liberal schools in the country, so I said, I'm here to make you a deal. I said, you can go to Northwestern for 4 years and I'll pay your tuition. Or I'm willing and able to write you a check right now for $200,000. You can play computer games for 4 years and we'll both be better off. He said, yeah, that sounded pretty good to him. But you have to really wonder whether these universities are worth $150,000, $200,000. And I think Kelly has it exactly right. Through innovation and competition and the internet and online courses, there is no reason that a first-class university degree should cost more than $50,000 or $60,000. And that's, I hope, what you're going to really aim for. I'm going to kind of skip ahead. I just want to show you this. The technological revolution and what's going on, how cheap these things are today. This is the good news of the economy. The reason I'm still so upbeat, despite all the dingbat things we're doing in Washington, is we're living in an age right now. If you look at the length of time it takes for new technologies to hit the American middle class, you can see telephones took 70 years from the time they were invented. But look as we move, and it was electricity 50 years. Look at the new inventions and how rapidly, this is so great about the digital age that we live in, how rapidly once these technologies become invented, how quickly they are democratized and affordable by the vast majority of Americans. And these are things like cell phones and internet and iPods and all of these things. And most Americans just can't really appreciate how much our society has changed, and that's why I do like to show this picture. How many of you know what movie this is from? It's Wall Street, right? And look at that thing, by the way. That's like a brick he's holding with a little antenna coming out of it. Now, here's the amazing thing. The reason I show that picture is that movie, Wall Street, was made in 1987. That's about 25 years ago. Anybody want to take a guess at what that thing cost 25 years ago? $4,200. $4,200. Today, they damn near give them away for free, right? And this is the kind of technological revolution that is transforming America in such an not just America, the whole world. I mean, we're going to see such spectacular advances, not just in these electronic gadgets and healthcare and in new drugs and vaccines and in every area. Transportation. I had dinner a few weeks ago with the guy who's making the Google car, the new car that's coming out in the next couple of years. There's no driver. You just, when you're done with dinner, you just go on your cell phone and tell the phone, you say in your phone, I'll be out in 8 minutes, and that car will be waiting there for you, and it'll take you wherever you want to go. It's transforming America in such an incredibly productive way. And the one thing I always say to young people, because the young people today, as I said, I talk to these young kids, they're so dour. They're, oh, why do I have to be alive today? Things are so terrible. The global ice caps are melting and all this stuff. And I always say to these kids, how many of you have a cell phone? They all raise their hand. How many of you have access to the internet? They all raise their hand. How many have a laptop and computer? They raise their hand. How many have iPods? Half the kids listen to the iPods while I give my lecture. So, they have all this stuff. And then they look at me like, duh. Of course we have these things because our kids, my teenagers are just like this. They think living without these things is like living in the Fred Flintstones era, right? They really do. And so we don't appreciate how much advances we've made. So what's holding things back? And Kelly, I promise this is the last point I'll make. So what's holding back this revolution in growth and prosperity that we should be seeing in 21st century America? And the answer to that is obvious to everyone in this room. We have an out-of-control federal budget. We are spending and borrowing way, way too much money. And I want to make a bipartisan point here. I've been kind of ragging on the Democrats, so let me rag on the Republicans, if I may, Kelly. I mean, I don't want to offend anybody here because I know there are a lot of Republicans in this room, but look at what happened to the budget starting in 2001, and that's when Republicans actually had all the levers of power, right? The Republicans controlled the White House, the House, and Senate, and you can see that not only did the defense budget go up, obviously the defense budget had to go up because of 9/11, but look at the non-defense spending. I mean, that's reprehensible. I mean, I always say, I'm around Republicans all the time. I always say, it's at least in Washington, I'm not casting aspersions on the Republicans here in the state legislature, but the Washington Republicans always say it's no wonder that they call themselves the pro-life party because they always find themselves in the fetal position, and it is so true. They just won't cut anything. Now, here's the amazing thing. So you see what happens in 2006, right? By 2006, the budget's gone through the roof, and finally the American voters say, look, if we want to elect big spenders, we're going to elect Nancy Pelosi and the professionals, right? And so that's in 2006 is when Pelosi became Speaker, and then of course 2008 was when President Obama becomes the president. And I'd say to you that the fundamental crisis and mistake of the Obama presidency has been that he came into office with this major offensive to try to get out of this recession, which, by the way, seems to be never ending, by spending money. Of course, we had the Obamacare bill, we had the $800 billion stimulus, and you can see the massive increase in spending, so much so that, as you know, in the last 4 years, we borrowed $5 trillion. I have a bumper sticker on my car, by the way, that says, thank God Barack Obama doesn't know what comes after $1 trillion. Because, the numbers are so gigantic. And so this is the crisis, this massive increase in debt. And I would simply say this, that when I talk to the young kids, what I tell them is that the challenge for their generation is going to be dealing with this debt crisis. This is why it's so puzzling to me, that these young people keep voting, for the very same people who created the debt in the first place. And I always say, who do you think is going to have to pay this off? Right? I mentioned that I have an 11-year-old son, and I'm on the road a lot, so when I'm at home, I try to tell him a bedtime story. And one of the reasons I think Americans aren't even angrier than they are is the numbers are so gigantic in the federal budget right now, we can't even relate to them. I mean, $1 trillion is $1 million. And so one of these nights, I thought I'd tell my son a little bedtime story about the national debt, because after all, he's going to have to repay it, right? So I thought he should know something about it. So I said to my son, David, do you know how much $1 trillion is? And his eyes kind of glazed over. So I said, well, David, let me ask you it this way. I said, who's the greatest basketball player in the world? And he instantly said LeBron James. So I said, well, David, how much money does LeBron James make? He knows that, too, because he knows everything about the NBA. And he knew that LeBron James, when you take into account all his shoe contracts and all this stuff, he makes $40 million a year. And what a great country this is, right? You can make $40 million a year to play basketball. So then I posed this question to my son, David, and I'll pose the same one to you all. How many seasons do you think LeBron James would have to play basketball at $40 million a season to have $1 trillion? And the answer is 25,000 seasons. So these numbers are gigantic. This is the cancer cell of the U.S. economy. And the good news is I do think we're going to fix this because we're Americans, right? We don't tolerate failure for long. And I would make this prediction to you to end on a very positive note. I do think Americans are going to get serious about this. I mean, how many of you would say that you're really angry about these debt numbers? I mean, raise your hand if you, and I think most Americans are. I mean, we are getting so fed up with this, and we believe that both parties are responsible for this, and I think you're going to see a taxpayer revolt against this. You're already seeing it, with President Obama saying, well, I'm going to have to close down Yosemite National Park and Yellowstone, and I'm going to have to cancel the White House tours, and people are saying, wait a minute, you're not going to cut all the waste out of the federal budget? You're going to cut the things that Americans care most about? Americans know that about 30% of of everything they send to Washington is wasted. And I guess what I'm saying is you're seeing this revolt. You can just seeing it bubbling up across America. And once we get this crisis under control, and we will, I believe in the next 5 years we are going to get this crisis under control. Once we do, and we bring this debt down to manageable levels, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to see the biggest American boom you ever saw. So thank you very much. It's been a great, great privilege to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for the kind attention.